everybody. Welcome. My name is Jennifer Core. I'm the Executive Director of the Tennessee Historical Society. Welcome to our last session of the year of Tennessee 101. We have a great program planned for you today, and we will pick up our programming in January of 2024, so make plans to join us for that. So to start off, I'd like to introduce our co-convener, Sean Pitts. Sean is one of the founders of Arts in McNary and Selmer in West Tennessee. And by day, he is a chiropractor, but he also has a vast knowledge of Tennessee material, culture, and music. And he helped line up all these great speakers for us. And so, Sean, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. I'm going to introduce my co-convener, fellow co-convener, Langston Wilkins, and he will introduce the speaker this evening. Langston Colin Wilkins is an assistant professor of folklore and African American studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research interest includes African American folk life, African American music, urban folklore, car culture, and public folklore. Dr. Wilkins received his PhD from Indiana University's Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology in 2016. He also holds an MA in African American and African diaspora studies from Indiana University and a BA in English from the University of Texas at Austin. He is the author of the recently published Everybody Inherits the Hood, Place, Identity, and Hip Hop Heritage in Houston. And that volume explores the relationship between music creation, place attachment, and local heritage within Houston, Texas hip hop music scene. His work has also appeared in the Journal of Folklore Research, the Washington Post, Houston Chronicle, and several other publications. And from 2019 until 2022, Dr. Wilkins served as the director of Center for Washington Cultural Traditions, a public program that seeks to document and preserve the traditional culture of Washington State. Dr. Wilkins also has deep connections to Tennessee. Prior to his public folk life appointment in Washington State, he served as a program officer at Humanities Tennessee and traditional arts specialist in Tennessee Arts Commission's folk life program. Dr. Wilkins is currently an executive board member of the American Folklore Society, and he's also a dear and respected friend of mine. And so I'm going to turn it over to him now.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I have the honor of introducing tonight's speaker, T. Minton, who is a musician, writer, and graduate of Middle Tennessee State University's Public History Master's Program. They currently work as a community educator, researcher, and director of special projects at the Belcourt, Nashville's oldest neighborhood theater. And so welcome, T. Minton.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. And thank you for everybody who's out there listening today. Appreciate your presence. Today, we're going to talk about the development of the Chitlin Circuit in Middle Tennessee. And we're going to dig in a little bit deep into the history of Rutherford County, Tennessee, which is the adjacent county to Nashville, Davidson County. And we're going to use that as a case study to talk about all of the intersecting histories and social phenomenon, cultural phenomenon that went into the development of the circuit, not just regionally and locally, but across the nation. So let's get started. So this research began back in 2020 when I was a graduate student required to do some local history on Rutherford County, Tennessee for a public history seminar. Having lived in Nashville since 2003, I've become pretty familiar with the general history of 20th century musical culture there. And I was pretty keen on how African Americans had shaped the musical landscape of the city, but I wasn't familiar at all with Rutherford County's relationship to Black music. So I decided to build on what I already knew about Nashville Black music to see if there were any interesting connections to what was happening in Rutherford County in their Black communities. So I came across a 2015 article from the Rutherford County Historical Society interviewing a local saxophone player named Raymond Summerhour about a ruined structure off of a road called Asbury Road called the El Dorado. It had been a rhythm and blues club Raymond played at in the 1960s and 70s. And here's a Google map of its location. It's highlighted in green up there in the corner and then zoomed in for you. So I was curious and I drove out to the structure, and it was tucked away behind an old farmhouse on a private property near Old Nashville Highway, which was first called the Nashville Turnpike, then the Dixie Highway. And keep that in mind because that will be an important note for later on. It was out near Stones River Battlefield National Park. So besides a sprinkling of early 20th century homes in the open fields of the park, there's not much out there, and it feels really rural and isolated, yet it's really kind of close to the city limits and it's right near the highway. So when I saw it, I wondered, what's El Dorado doing all the way out here, and why was it here, and what is this place really? So I went searching for the answers to those questions, and what was revealed is that, yes, there was a connection to this venue, El Dorado, and Black folks in Nashville during the first half of the 20th century. And beyond that, there was a temporal and spatial pattern connecting 100 years of Black musical, political, and cultural history in Rutherford County. And that local history was connected to Black communities across the South and the nation more broadly. And here's how some of those connections begin to coalesce in the research. So this is a map of the Battle of Stones River, geolocated on top of Rutherford County, and it shows how the war was fought there. What became interesting to me is its proximity to El Dorado Club, and I wondered what might explain that. The Stones River battlefield in Rutherford County had been a contraband camp during the Civil War. In 1861, the Union Army and Congress agreed that enslaved people who escaped their masters or who went to Union lines to fight in the war were no longer legally enslaved. They were considered contrabands of war or captured enemy property. So being contraband or being in a contraband camp for an African-American was really a placeholder for freedom and until emancipation came more formally. So after the Civil War ended, these self-emancipated folks became landowners, and generally they settled close by the regions where major battles had been fought. In Rutherford County, one of those historically Black communities is called the Cemetery. And on this parcel map, you can see that all the blue areas there on the right indicate the first and second generation of land ownership for Black folks after the Civil War ended on that battlefield. And you can see that this map, by 1929, Black ownership was primary in this area, though there were some white folks who owned property. So these pioneers of Black life, they shaped new ways to live and become, in spite of the racialized terror that still surrounded them during the Reconstruction and Jim Crow eras. In Rutherford County, this new Black world contained social organizations, schools, churches, the future urban and rural communities that would surround this place called the Cemetery. It was filled with culture. It was filled with music. So these maps became kind of the crux of the work, a case study, if you will, for my larger argument, which, so take a look at the yellow arrows on the left, and that indicates where El Dorado is in relationship to the battlefield, the highway that's running next to it, and the establishment of Rutherford County's first free community of African Americans. These maps demonstrate a cultural, social, and political system of change over 100 years of time. And it gestures to a trend that would be patterned in other Black communities across the region, the state, and across the country. And here's how. So bear with me, it's going to be kind of a lot of local and state history thrown at you, but these maps start with a guy named G.H. Minton. He was an African-American born and raised in the Cemetery community. He owned property there, and it's that his property is indicated by the two yellow arrows on the right here. The one furthest to the right shows that 2 generations after Minton, his descendant, Percy Minton Jr., took ownership of a different parcel of land which housed the venue El Dorado Club, and that's indicated on the left arrow back up in the corner of the right map. And so why is this? Why is this that there was first generation land and then another generation came and they didn't own the same land? Well, between 1929 and 1932, landowners in the Cemetery community were forcibly removed from their properties by governmental seizure through eminent domain for the purposes of establishing Stones River Military Park. And though some white citizens, like I said, also own land in the Cedars, or the Cemetery as it's also called, the community was predominantly Black, and it had sprung forth from the aforementioned contraband camp. In 1927, a congressional commission overseeing the creation of the park determined that the land held by these Black owners was generally less valuable than land owned by whites. So this decided that after the land seizure, Black folks would be compensated at a dramatically lower rate than those of their white peers. And this military park seemed to serve three purposes. The first purpose was economic. The park would draw white visitors traveling along the Dixie Highway, that highway I mentioned earlier, through into the county and directly into the city center of Murfreesboro to engage in commerce. Secondly, the purpose was to institutionalize white supremacy by perpetuating the myth of the lost cause to these white tourists by valiantly commemorating the Civil War battle that had been fought there a half a century before. And the third purpose was to weaken the Black community overall by fracturing the mental and physical geographies of the people who were there through the systemic use of propaganda, through displacement, and in some cases through the actual erasure of their culture and land. So in summary, the creation of Stones River National Park, I'm arguing, was the first major act of what would later be called urban renewal. Like I said, a term that we'll discuss here in a minute. It was the first time that an urban renewal type project that had been funded in tandem by the state and federal partnership came into Rutherford County. But, however, white supremacy was not able to fully disappear the presence and culture of African Americans in this area. They resisted and they adapted, as is evidenced by the continued presence of Black culture in Rutherford County across the century and even to today. So we'll take a look at these acts of resistance and explore some of the Black music and entertainment venues that contained and proliferated Black culture, as well as some of the people who helped spread this vernacular culture and music across the nation, sustaining a Black diaspora that has been carried across centuries. So here's where we need to get into a little bit of history about road building projects, because that's sort of the second tier of this argument. Then I'll move on to discuss the Chitlin Circuit, and hopefully we'll be able to contain all of this, all these concepts in our mind. So about road building projects, we're going to talk about how trails became turnpikes, turnpikes became highways, and highways became interstates. So prior to the Civil War, most roadways in Tennessee were irregular dirt roads. They emerged from game trails and pathways forged by Native Americans and early European settlers. These unimproved roads were accessible by foot, horse, and in some cases, carriage. By the 1830s, these trails became new, improved, and maintained roads that were called turnpikes. A generation later, the Nashville Turnpike, which we've been discussing from the maps earlier, became a crucial roadway moving troops and supplies in and out of the area of the cemetery and the greater region of Rutherford County and Nashville and all of that during the Civil War. And it ran directly through the Battle of Stones River, directly through Murfreesboro, together with the tracks of the Nashville-Chattanooga Railroad, which paralleled the turnpike. And that was very common with turnpikes, that the railroad and the roads would be right next to each other. This road system served as the community's primary link to the outside world. So now enters the Dixie Highway. In 1916, the federal government began to assume responsibility for swaths of the nation's roads, passing the Federal Aid Highway Act. Constructed between 1915 and 1927, the Dixie Highway consisted of 5,706 miles of road systems connecting Ontario, Canada, from the north to Miami, Florida in the south. No other state had as many miles of Dixie Highway within its borders than the state of Tennessee. The eastern and western sections of the highway met in Chattanooga, which was also the national headquarters of the Dixie Highway Association. And at the time of its completion, it was the second most traveled highway in the southeastern United States. Tennessee, particularly Middle Tennessee, and particularly Rutherford County in many ways, benefited the most from this new highway. The Dixie Highway was the impetus for modernizing the South during the first quarter of the 20th century, and it helped the region secure economic, social, and political successes that altered infrastructure and politics. The successes of the highway in modernizing the South influenced both rural and urban white and non-white Americans. However, the builders and supporters of the Dixie Highway, of course, did not consider the interests of African Americans along the route in three important ways. One, the route was fully segregated and all the accommodations were deferential to the comfort and needs of white tourists. Two, political actors at the local, state, and federal level were corrupt and often engaged in bribery and favor systems as a way to decide where the roads would be located best for white people. And three, the mass incarceration of African Americans under Jim Crow created the system of free exploitable labor used to construct major portions of the highway. So the system for how highways would be built served as a template for the progressive era infrastructure projects that would come, and it was replicated all over the South. In Rutherford County, the Nashville Turnpike, as we've been discussing, was absorbed into the Dixie Highway and became a major artery of the new highway system. And today its remnants are called Old Nashville Highway and College Street in the interior of the city. The latter marks the stretch of road from the countryside that, like I said, runs parallel to the Stones River battlefield. And the expansion of the Dixie Highway made Rutherford County and Middle Tennessee generally accessible from multiple directions in the state, as well as outside of Tennessee's borders. So like this newspaper article here says, it was the hub of the Wheel of Tennessee. So let's talk about how highways became interstates. In 1945, the Tennessee General Assembly passed the Slum Clearance and Urban Redevelopment Act. This legislation authorized local housing authorities to condemn neighborhoods as slums and raise them through eminent domain. The acts bore no single definition on what the term slum meant, so it was left up to the discretion of local authorities to decide based on subjectivity. If not at all, in many cases, the people deciding this were white elites. As a continuation of segregationist Jim Crow policies, historically, African-American neighborhoods were prioritized for these slum clearance projects. And as a result, many African Americans were relocated to housing projects, which were more structurally sound, but perpetuated segregation by increasing the concentration of communities by race. They were also ownership prohibitive, either by cost or were designated to be leased only. So it was distinctly harmful to Black folks who had been homeowners before removal. In 1949, the Federal Housing Act committed Congress to funding 2/3 of the cost of these projects with local governments, and they were required, the local governments required to fund the remaining. So it exacerbated the ongoing discriminatory practices of housing displacement in two really important ways. It allowed them more rights to reclaim land from citizens through an eminent domain, not just for civic projects, though, but for resale to private owners. And two, it allowed for a process called redlining. And just as a historical aside, Nashville's 1949 Capitol Hill redevelopment plan, which was part of this, was the nation's first urban renewal project funded by Congress. So it set a precedent for municipalities across the South and the nation, including Rutherford County, who would follow shortly thereafter. And it's also worth noting that the city of Nashville is directly in line in this interstate system that we're discussing. It's directly linked through this Old Nashville/Dixie Highway. So some of you are familiar with redlining. If you're not, it's the process where banks refuse to give mortgages to African Americans. So basically, it offers them extracting or unusually severe terms or subprime loans. It was a way to keep Black people from owning homes in white neighborhoods and why their properties would become labeled undesirable later on for slum clearance projects. Eminent domain, of course, we've already kind of talked about a little bit, but it was utilized to leverage Black-owned land to create roads and public housing in order to divest Black wealth into white businesses who then replaced that said Black land with commercial, industrial, and residential developments. So the privately acquired land of the 1950s and 60s that came after this act became the foundation for many of the buildings that you still see today that dominate the skylines of virtually every American city and set the precedent for what eminent domain is today and remains today. So here's where the public policies become sort of compounding, which is that in 1956, the Federal Highway Aid Act authorized the construction of National Interstate Highway System, and that would expand these existing highways into larger interstates. So these plans just piggybacked onto the Federal Housing and Urban Redevelopment Acts that were happening in the late 40s. And And like I said, they were already disproportionately targeting African-American communities. So these interstates were, of course, then routed through Black communities and around white ones. So the roads bisected the landscapes in such a way as to divide major neighborhood thoroughfares in Black communities, or just completely razed them, and just took what had not already been taken just after 1945. So the legacy of these interstates is the creation of isolated, racialized geographies, or Black urban centers and white suburban enclaves. So, like those city planners in Nashville had, Rutherford County officials rerouted the Dixie Highway into downtown Murfreesboro, past that first historic Black community of free people, and into the city center beginning around 1951. They called it the Broad Street Development Project. It displaced a Black community that had emerged from this first original community near the battlefield called the Bottoms. And this historically Black community, like I said, was an extension of the one before, just down the road on the same road. So this history of displacement by urban development happened across the landscape of the Chitlin Circuit. And that's part of my argument, which is that it affected dozens, if not hundreds, of African-American owned, operated, or frequented entertainment venues, and adjacently, their supportive businesses. So it happened, we know, in Jefferson Street in Nashville proper. It happened in the Capitol Hill district of Nashville. It happened in the Edge Hill communities of Nashville. It happened on Bill Street in Memphis, which is another really iconic, very previously discussed location of the Chitlin Circuit. So, it's important to keep in mind, while this sort of onslaught of displacement and everything was happening, African Americans did have agency, and they adapted to the continuation of these series of road building projects, the trails into turnpikes, turnpikes into highways, highways into interstates. They did all this through ingenuity and resilience. And in spite of the social restrictions and displacement, they used these systems to their advantage. They created their own spaces and culture along these highway routes. Freedom to travel, it's important to keep in mind, freedom to travel is a right assumed as fundamental to white Americans, but it was never simple for Black Americans. Millions of enslaved people had little to no freedom to travel without papers or badges from their owners. If they didn't have documents, they were imprisoned, sold, beaten, murdered by roving slave patrollers. So the period of emancipation and Reconstruction opened up some new pathways to freedom, literally and figuratively, as road development happened. But, by the second decade of the 20th century, African Americans became increasingly more mobile through automobile ownership and through this expansion of highways into interstates. And in doing this, some of them stayed in the South. Many of them fled into nearby cities or to urban centers in the North. They took advantage of this greater freedom of mobility. So it's no surprise that their vernacular music culture followed these same highway systems throughout the South, into the northern interior, places regionally, locally. That's how the music starts spreading across these highways and interstate systems. So something like the improved Dixie Highway, of course, was a way to enable this kind of great migration of people, culture, music into places like Chicago and Detroit, Memphis, Chattanooga, all of these places that have been very much discussed by other scholars as very important epicenters of Black musical culture and stops along the Chitlin Circuit. So let's talk about the Chitlin Circuit. Here's a little map, and here's some imagery about what the Chitlin Circuit was like. First, I'll say, continuing the story from earlier about Raymond's summer hour, in 2020, I met Raymond for the first time. And he was the narrator of that article that inspired this research. And Ray, he spoke like most musicians who spent their lives hacking away at their craft. He told me stories about performing at home in Rutherford County and on the road. He talked about where and how he toured in his band. They piled in a car with their gear. They stopped at Black-only establishments. They used the back door at the white ones, and, they prayed never to be stopped in traffic or to break down in a sundown town. He told me about the different artists he played with, and met along the way, James Brown's sax player, Joe Tex, Bo Diddley, Bobby Blue Bland, very iconic Black performers. He described all the different sanctioned and unsanctioned venues he performed at: a theater or a nightclub with beautiful leather seats, velvet curtains, a dress code, a juke joint behind someone's house with sawdust on the floor, gambling tables, a brown bagging policy where you bring your own booze, a restaurant with a dance floor. He talked about the music they played: originals, covers, 2 to 4 hour sets of rhythm and blues, electric guitars, full horn sections, drums, keys, and the people, ordinary Black folks in these small towns and cities, and some really extraordinary ones, people who would become future legends, like Jimi Hendrix and Escarita. He described the relationship between a musical geography of space and time, so of the mind, what it meant to be Black during a time, and the musical geography of the landscape, an actual map where communities and their venues were located and why they were there. Raymond was talking about the Chitlin Circuit, and that's how he was describing it. So what is this word? For those of you unfamiliar, the word chitlin is a shortening of the word chitterlings. So it's a culinary delicacy that was created by enslaved African Americans using the scrap meat of pig intestines. And chitlins have been understood as a metaphor referring to the ability of African Americans to create and thrive in spite of necessity. So the Chitlin Circuit then is a title describing a geography born of necessity for Black people to persist before, the passing of the Civil Rights Act circa 1964, when segregation became illegal. So the Chitlin Circuit is both a real and an imagined space. And let's just keep that in mind moving forward. And that's the argument I'm trying to make here as well, which is it describes an ethnic geography that's defined by race and the racialized experience of African Americans during segregation, as well as a physical space. It's a geography of places that are linked together across cities, regions, states, and a nation. And it spread early American vernacular music forms across all of these state lines and across all of these highway systems into Black communities. So we're going to think of it as a temporal geography. Let's talk about that really quick. So ethnography teaches us that human beings understand their reality in relationship to 3 things: time, space, and place. So consider that the United States is defined by its relationship to the legacy of slavery, in that legalized and practiced segregation largely defined our society during the first 100 years of the Civil War, or after the Civil War, pardon me. These social and systemic systems of oppression greatly limited Black life and culture. And this forced Black people to cultivate innovative ways to augment their reality and use space and place for their own use value. Additionally, consider that the idea of the South as a concept is also an abstraction of the total American experience, where a replicable reality of institutionalized racism has and continues to exist across the country. So this, if you think about it that way, this newly imagined map of the South, which is spread across America, highlights the failed promises of freedom and liberation that were expected to come from African Americans gaining their freedom and through emancipation or migrating in mass during the 20th century. That is to say, institutionalized racism in the form of Jim Crow and the housing discrimination, the mass incarceration, the income inequality, the racialized violence, slamming a highway through a Black neighborhood, expanding it into an interstate and disappearing whole neighborhoods altogether, or moving entire families and communities somewhere else. This existed everywhere in America. So if we can adopt this intellectual framework about the South, it will help us center the Black experience through geography and help us to consider, that cultural densities disguised by the political functions of white supremacy have done real systemic harm across space and time. It's a perspective that Black culture making and placemaking are intentional acts of Black resistance and identity formation, and it results in the creation of economic, cultural power structures that have influenced not just Black life, but the whole of the nation. There are scholars Hunter and Robinson, they call it a chocolate city. And this understanding of the South as chocolate cities across the country is a really cool way of thinking about spatial and temporal, ethnically defined spaces that can really help historians understand how particular landscapes have come to be defined by the unique experiences of a separate or particular group of people like African Americans. So let's talk about it really quick as the Chitlin Circuit as a physical geography. African American communities in Rutherford County in this case study, as well as those traveling the circuit more broadly, can be imagined with the same subjectivity that we were just discussing before. Their entertainment venues were racially marked, and they existed in a spatial imaginary that was racially marked. The Chitlin Circuit is a 20th century African-American musical geography, and it's a part of a continuum of Black consciousness and musical experience across our nation. So it is geography of the mind, it is geography of a map. Just something to think about as we move forward and experience this. So the Chitlin Circuit specifically in Nashville has been really well documented by other scholars like Michael Gray and the Country Music Hall of Fame and their exhibit, Night Train to Nashville. But I wanted to include it here as a little bit of a primer because it will come into some of the storytelling a little bit later. But this is a picture of, on the left corner there, of a young Jimi Hendrix with bassist Billy Cox, his longtime musical collaborator who's still alive today, living in Nashville, from 1962 at a club in Nashville on the Chitlin Circuit. And below are some patrons on Jefferson Street, a very pivotal stop on the circuit. And in this video here, Jimmy is playing on this show here called Night Train to Nashville, which is from this same era. Let me see if I can move forward. And he is in the back left corner playing guitar. You'll see him in front of that left dancer there. So I just thought it'd be fun for us to get set the scene a little bit. So, I don't want to get too far into the minutia of, my research methods and everything, but I did want you to just see this chart, which is every single Chitlin Circuit venue, entertainment space that I was able to locate in my research that kind of got me thinking about the relationship between where they were and these highway systems. And so I identified all of them, as many as I could, and using their historic addresses, I mapped the latitude and longitude. And what that showed me then is that my hunch about the cemetery community and those original settlements of Black folks and the emergence of Black culture and places for Black music popping up around these original road systems was mapped across time. These venues that are in this chart here, they, as you move through time and you see the trails become turnpikes, the turnpikes become highways, the highways become interstates. As you see that over time, you can see the development of these venues along with the development of those roads. And also, you can see that over time, as the highways expanded into interstates, these venues begin to disappear, close, or move to a totally separate location altogether. So that's kind of how I got the evidence, the proof of this theory that I'm trying to explain to you here, which is that, there's too many of them to name here, but that's the data that explains what I'm talking about. And if you want to see them all, they're in my thesis. It's free online, but I don't expect you to do that. But so let's go through some of the different periods and talk about the ways that this music spanned space and time. And we're going to talk specifically about Rutherford County because that was my case study. So let's talk about the Emancipation and Reconstruction era. African Americans, they filled these contraband camps with music, just as they had filled the fields of plantations, their homes, and their houses of worship. They used instruments like fiddles, guitars, fifes, drums, and bones, which were a rhythm instrument made actually from animal ribs and leg bones. And you can see some of the instrumentation here in this picture here. They also traded songs on paper. They exchanged lyric books of popular songs called songsters, and songsters had lyrics that ranged from poetic expressions of love and everyday life to patriotic recollections and stuff about the specific war battles. And these songs were collaborative and evolving. You can see that there's no musical notation on them. So how the music was played to accompany the songsters was different. There were different versions, and they were regional, they were specific, but they were also spread around, and people learned them from other people as people were moving across space and time. So the renditions, they varied widely by person, region, and regiment. And each songster and performance reflected, the needs of that particular person or that group of people, their need to cope with the social conditions of war and of enslavement. So the term songster actually also evolved to mean an African American who made their living as a traveling musician, which is an interesting emergence as well. So enslaved people developed their own musical ideas and their own worship styles that were separate from white people's control of them in the fields of plantations. This style of music that they were developing is called old time music. And it was a blend of African traditions like syncopation, Negro spirituals, string band music, and it's considered the vernacular precursor to modern country music in many ways. String band music is played on anything with strings, meaning a guitar, banjo, or fiddle, but it also signifies instrumentation on, homemade instruments, stuff like washboards, washtub bass, that kind of thing. One string, diddly bows, that sort of stuff. Cigar box things. This here is a guy named Walter Greer. He was born in Rutherford County, where he also learned to play music, and he learned to play on a cigar box fiddle. He is a character who emerges in the research, and I thought he was really interesting. And there's a larger project on him, which you can visit if you want to hear all of the recording of him that came out of the 70s. But basically, he was born in 1889 in Rutherford County in a little place called Walter Hill. And, we know about him because a folklorist named Robert Cogswell recorded him in 1975, a year before he passed away. So in these recordings, we're hearing repertory from times of enslavement, songs that he learned through generations of people who had been living in the region. We also know that he was in the military and he traveled. So this music traveled with him, and he was spreading it while he was traveling too. As he played his fiddle on the road. So, at some point he also joined up in some string bands in the Nashville area and was kind of, playing fiddle music in that part of the Chitlin Circuit. But, here's a little bit of a clip for you. I don't want to play the whole thing, but it's out there if you want to hear it. But you can just sort of hear from that little clip, like how good he was. And if you want to check it out, please do. We don't have time to go through all of it, sadly, but let's talk about the progressive era a little bit. In the first decade of the 20th century, African Americans in Murfreesboro and Rutherford County, they expanded their businesses and institutions as they gained wealth and prominence in their own city. They increased Black business. So in a place called the Bottoms, like I mentioned earlier, that was later displaced with highway expansion into interstates. That was the concentration sort of in the downtown area of the hub of Black business at the first decade of the 20th century. And this is where things like medicine shows, circus style tent shows, minstrel performances, buskers, live theater, string band orchestras. This is where they were all kind of coalescing as they were traveling regionally in and out of Rutherford County. And all Black productions, were very popular at the time. They mixed song, dance, and comedy, and they were culturally all their own. And it was on this circuit that the music of ragtime and string band performance, this old time music and gospel converged to develop what would be the underpinnings later of the blues. So for Black folks touring and developing this circuit, this early form of the Chitlin Circuit, this experience signified their freedom, particularly those who were in these all Black productions. And the liberation and personal safety of these productions helped these African Americans achieve higher levels of intellectual, personal, and creative liberty, because they wrote, directed, performed, and starred in their own productions and performed it for Black communities. It also freed them up from sort of the racist stereotyping of blackface minstrelsy, which was so prominent in the white controlled portions of it. So let's talk about this woman here, since I don't feel like she gets enough praise. And she is called Madam Emma Azalea Hackley. She was one of the most important figures in 20th century Black music history, in my opinion. She was born in Rutherford County in 1867, just 2 years after the end of the Civil War. Her mother, Carilla, was an educated woman and a highly proficient, classically trained, steeped in Black tradition musician. She opened one of the first schools for Black children in Rutherford County. And, schools were the educational arm of the first Black churches. So they were places where African-American children inherited an understanding about music and its cultural context. Azalea was considered a musical prodigy, and her mother was her first teacher. She reached her 20s in the 1890s, and by that time she was touring all over the world. She'd become one of the most prominent concert, piano, and vocal soloists in the United States. She referred to the music she performed and taught as Negro folk, which was a combination of Negro spirituals with classical music, operatic music, and original compositions that would later sort of become ragtime. So she's credited as being the initiator of the first major festivals promoting Black folk music. And these concerts took place across the South. They were funded, produced, and performed exclusively by thousands of different African-American musicians, many of whom performed these shows for mixed race audiences. So her story can teach us a lot about how to think broader about ethnic geography and how these geographies were shaped by African-American music and music-making culture. Her story about the South is part of this idea that the South is a continuum. It's a place mapped across the whole country, and it's a diaspora of African-American musical and cultural relationships, because these ideas were shared and they were spread across these landscapes. Her life represents an idea of what autonomy and success meant for Black folks touring these circuits. She demonstrated that travel could be an instrument of freedom, and that one's identity could be art, and that art could be a legacy bound to the collective past, the present, and the future. So she gifted this integrated relationship about music to thousands of other Black folks who were her musical pupils. She taught them. It illuminates the continuity of consciousness about what it means for Black music to be racialized. And so I just wanted to share really quick, one of her students among the many thousands was the wonderful and amazing Marian Anderson, who's very well known. But here she is performing a little bit at the Lincoln Memorial. So you can just kind of hear. So you can sort of hear like what would have been some of Azalea's influence on her. And, please look into her. She's an amazing, amazing woman. Let's talk about the segregation and interwar era really quick. The development and spread of early blues music across this Chitlin Circuit marked a clear paradigmatic shift in Black culture and American popular music. Black vaudeville companies, the ones that I was just talking about in the decades prior, they were owned and operated and featured all Black casts. And so they were at the helm of the cultural turn in music that came in the roaring 20s. And Bessie Smith was arguably the most notable blues musician to emerge from this era, and she was the highest paid and best-selling blues recording artist of the 1920s. She was born in Chattanooga, Tennessee in 1894, a location on the circuit, and as I mentioned earlier, the hub of decision making about what will become the Dixie Highway. So she traveled to and from that part of the circuit very often. She emerged as a professional musician and dancer around 1909 when she was living in Tennessee. And by the end of her recording career in 1933, she had earned, Empress of the Blues. So she built part of her reputation across the Dixie Highway, like I said, and all of the Chitlin Circuit waysides like Nashville, Chattanooga, and Atlanta. For example, between 1926 and 1927, she toured through Middle Tennessee in a large group with other Black women performers billed as Shufflin' Sam from Alabama. What's really cool about this photo is when I found it, and I can't remember which archive, but when I found it, I actually didn't know that was Bessie Smith. I was looking for something else entirely. And when I saw the picture in the corner, I thought, is that her? So I sent it to the people in Chattanooga who run the museum about her, and they verified. And yeah, it was the first identification of her in this poster too, which was a really cool thing that came out of this research. So let's fast forward a bit, and we're going to talk about Turner Hall and the Moonlight Inn. So we're now in like sort of 1930s era. The Moonlight Inn and Turner Hall are venues that no longer exist as structures. They were displaced through some of this shuffling around of Black community and this sort of crushing of the soul of what was happening in Rutherford County over time. But we can conclude through evidence that I'll talk about that both provided really large dance halls, most likely to accommodate at least 100 patrons on a busy night. So much about their presence as a place can be understood, through the Sanborn map, which you can see below. And I actually used some testimony in a court transcript, how the venue was described in that transcript, to sort of help piece together what, in cross-reference, what it might look like, which was just kind of a fun way of demonstrating how technology and old historic documents can be in conversation with each other. So this picture in the corner is really a CAD drawing that I had made for this project, to just sort of reimagine what the space was like based on these historic documentaries. But what's cool about this is not only do we get to see the owners here, that's Ellen Wade and Aaron Wade, but it's rumored that Count Basie and his orchestra or Tina Turner may have played at these venues. So it's a really cool way to locate the Chitlin Circuit across the 1930s into the 50s. So let's get into the post-war era, and we're going to talk about the El Dorado Club, since we've kind of arrived at it, and it was the more specific case study. It was the only venue in this study that I could really dive deep into because the structure still exists, and one of the last remaining performers, Raymond Summerhour, is still alive and well and was able to tell us. So this is the El Dorado Club that we speak of. There's a mural inside the club of an old car that's at the entrance. And here's what it looks like from above. So you can see that rounded part in the back is where the stage was, but you would enter through this front door, and that's where you'd pay your ticket. And anyway, so the club emerged, in the mid to late 50s, early 60s. It as a discreetly placed, one-room juke joint behind a private property on Asbury Lane in Murfreesboro. It's nestled, like I said earlier, on this outer edges of the cemetery community. And the club was most likely a place where, in an effort to be, was most likely a place that was making an effort to be far away from the watchful eye of white folks, so that the African Americans who frequented this place would feel safe to have a good time. So additionally and conveniently, access to the club, came directly, like I said, through this old Nashville highway system that had been the Dixie Highway. At the club, patrons, they enjoyed music, dancing, sometimes drinking, and sometimes gaming. It was a really cool place. Here's Raymond right there. So that's saxophone player Raymond Summerhour, the last living legend of this club. Raymond today, I believe, is 83 years old. Anyway, he was a member of a band called the Dukes, and there he is holding a poster at the Country Music Hall of Fame. They hold collections of posters from a lot of these venues, including El Dorado. So Raymond was in the house band there, and due to the high level of proficiency in the players along the circuit and in this band, and the fact that these tours were made on shoestring budgets, they were very do-it-yourself in some cases. It was common practice for bands like the Dukes to travel either by themselves to make a living, or to just sort of park it at their home base and play behind performers who would travel through and needed a house band. So that's what Raymond did there. He was part of the house band. And let's get a little taste of his playing. This is a video from him playing in 2020. He's playing James Brown's 1961 single Night Train at a Mexican restaurant.
We can't hear the music. Nikki's going to explain to you how you can share it so that we can hear the music.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. If you could reshare your screen, and then when you are selecting which screen you're sharing, just click share computer audio as well, and then click share. It should work for us.
Oh, sorry about that, y'all.
It's okay. I think we're going to link any of the YouTube videos that you've used on the Padlet, so everybody can check out everything that you've shared so far.
Yeah. Truly, though, we could probably just, for sake of time, I don't know if it's going to work, which is sad. But again, whoever's here, you can see it later on.
Yeah, we'll make sure everybody has the links to the videos.
Okay. Well, let's just see them.
It works. Nope, I spoke too soon.
All right. Some of these videos are silent, so this is not one of them, but you can still see it. So here's some posters. These come from the Country Music Hall of Fame, their collections on the club. And this is a guy called Earl Gaines. You can see in this poster here. The Dukes perform behind artists like this: Earl Gaines, Buford Majors, Hal Hebb, Jackie Shane. Summerhour remembers Jimi Hendrix coming by the club when he was stationed at Fort Campbell, a nearby military base. He came through the club around like 1962 and sat in with his band. And apparently he didn't have a guitar cable and they had to help him out with that. But even back then, Raymond said he was working on the stuff that he would later become really famous for, like flipping his guitar behind his head and trying to play, blindly like that. But the image you see here is of Earl Gaines. He's playing on a show called The Beat, which was a TV show airing out of Texas that featured a lot of the Chitlin Circuit rhythm and blues artists that were coming up in the mid 60s. Like Earl Gaines and like Jackie Shane and people like that. So we're going to go next really quick. We're running out of time, but I want you to see. Another thing that was happening at the club was that there were women performers there. The women who performed there were dancers. they were billed as exotic or shake dancers, and these women were often the show openers, or they were the in-between act entertainers. Shake dancers also almost always went by a stage name, performing under, monikers like Miss Sando, Miss Body, Miss Sexy Ways. These monikers were a way to separate them from their legal identities, which offered these women a certain level of mystique, but it also offered them protection and anonymity in a world that would have, most certainly put them at risk for doing this kind of art form. The names also gave them power of notoriety because it attracted fans to their persona and their style of performing. Historian Jackie Malone has traced the history of shake dance to the years just after the Civil War, to the New York City, to a New York City venue that was run by a Black banjo player named Ike Hines. And in her research, she discovered that the dance, the original shake dance, became known as the Hoochie Coochie when it premiered at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. So today, shake dance is really what we consider burlesque, but it has its origins in this period just after the Civil War and hitting the world stage at the Chicago World's Fair. So let's talk about Jackie Shane, another regular performer at the El Dorado and across the Chitlin Circuit. Jackie's getting her flowers now lately, which is really great. But for years, she's sort of, she became a bit of a recluse. And so her star sort of faded into the background. But there's Nashville Queer History, as an aside, is working on getting her a historic marker in Nashville. But anyway, she was born in 1940 in Nashville, began, performing locally around the age of, 16, 17. In the late 50s. She initially was a drummer, and she sang when she drummed. She would stand up when she played. She was a really amazing performer and was really popular in the region. She had a beautiful voice, and all of that landed her some session work in the region. But she came out to El Dorado often to play. And I wanted to mention her because not only does she represent so much of what was happening at the time, but she's considered a pioneering transgender performer. That is to say that as early as the 1960s, she was living openly as herself. She was wearing long hair, makeup, and jewelry, and Miss Jackie was being Miss Jackie. There she is down here. I don't know if you can really see her, but there she is with a bunch of dancers at a club as well. Presumably some of them transgender as well. This video, which we'll link to, is her performing on the show that was centered around R&B performers based out of Nashville. It was called Night Train to Nashville. And some of that's online. There she is. So this is an image of what Raymond had written down, all of the different performers that he performed with over the years, just as a way, like I said, to sort of talk about the circuit more specifically in his career. But you can see all of those names: Joe Tex, Bo Diddley, Little Willie John, Jimi Hendrix, all those people he played with. And we'll skip this video, but the video is of Casey Clark, a guitar player from the Dukes, performing a Jimi Hendrix song. He was not there the night that Jimi Hendrix stopped by, but he, because he replaced the original guitar player later on. But anyway, he added it to his repertoire and for years did it as a tribute to those days on the Chitlin Circuit and Jimi Hendrix's legacy and the Dukes' legacy. So, we're at the end here, but I believe, there's been a lot of writing and talk about the Chitlin Circuit, like I said, in Middle Tennessee and across the country. But I think this is the first major work that attempts to examine the circuit as both a temporal and a spatial geography, specifically using a technology like GIS mapping, geolocating. And I didn't get into that too much because it's kind of heady and it's a little bit boring, but essentially, it's a way to locate things on a map and see all of the spatial relationships across space and time. So using that technology is how I was able to construct this argument that venues popped up in historically Black neighborhoods, which emerged out of these contraband camps, which were nearby road systems, and that over time, as the music spread and as the influx of these road building projects were expanded, they decimated these neighborhoods, and they actually systemically destroyed the locations for making this music in many situations. And so you see the emergence of the venues around the circuit, around these highway systems, and then you see their systemic disappearance. And so, you know, it all forever altered the musical landscape locally in Middle Tennessee, but also nationally across the country. My hope is, you know, that someone out there will do some more GIS mapping so that this research can be talked about in other locations along the Chitlin Circuit, so that we can maybe learn some new historic relationships to road building projects and the emerging vernacular Black music culture across 100 years. But for now, this is where it's at. So hopefully there's someone out there who will help out and will add to it. But you know, parts of, you know, some historians have argued that the Chitlin Circuit no longer exists, and in some ways that because of these highways blasting through Black neighborhoods into interstates, that's why. But, you know, I'm going to argue that, you know, the resistance continues. And even if it's just in state of mind, you know, there's still Black folks in Rutherford County who are playing music like Raymond. They're still carrying on the traditions. They're still eating soul food at restaurants like the Clearview, where shows were. They're still going to the Elks Lodge, where some of these shows were hosted on the circuit. And they're keeping these musical and cultural traditions alive. So I would say that in spite of the best efforts of these racist policies to disappear and replace Black culture, it continues on. And it's all still connected to what's happening today. So I appreciate each of you being here today. Your presence, your questions, and your feedback, of course, will be welcome. But I would like to leave you with these QR codes and stuff. If you want to check out, I've made some playlists. You can hear them, all the different artists that played at the Eldorado Club on a Spotify playlist, and then more generally just on the Chitlin Circuit in Middle Tennessee. And then if you want to check out that entire recording of that guy, Walter Greer, you can do it there. And that's it. Thanks for having me.